I decided this morning in preparation for this message that I would start off with some vulnerability. So I'm going to tell you something about me, and I'm risking a lot here because there's a decent chance you're going to change how you view me. So I understand that, and I thought, you know what? It's going to be worth it. You're going to change your mind about me, and that's fine. That's fine, but I'll make the point. Um, so Amy and I, we've been married now for almost 19 years, and we're in a pretty good rhythm. Like we've kind of figured some things out in that time. One of those is our, kind of roles and responsibilities of what we do. You probably heard me say that before. I like to cook. She likes to clean, so that works out really well. The thing about marriage, though, it shows you how selfish you are. I am great doing what I've been tasked to do, what is my responsibility, what I've accepted to do. I'm like, yep, I got to do that. It's good. We're good. There's a thing that happens though when Amy gets sick. So when Amy gets sick and she's lying on the couch and she's down and out, I do a couple things. First of all, I have to deep breath. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to be really nice right now because I hate doing the dishes. And at first, I let them pile up a little bit just to be like, is this like a headache that's going to go away in just a little bit? Because if not, she can handle the dishes when she's done with that. And then if it's serious, then I actually have to put on my big boy pants and do the dishes. And I hate it. I'm just being honest with you. I hate doing the dishes. My wife is sick, laying on the couch, and I'm grumbling and complaining about dishes. I know this about all of us, though. Every single one of us in this room has things that we know we should do, and with the greatest amount of gut level wrenching aspect of our being, we try to fight it. I'm not gonna do that. Not a chance. Not a chance. Does she have a fever? I don't know. So I know that's true about all of us. We don't do the things that we know we should do, and we fight against it. And what the story that we're going to hear about today is about 120,000 times worse than what I just shared with you. So I feel a little bit better by the end. This series, if you've been kind of following along with us, Floods, Giants, and Whales, oh my, we've been talking about some Old Testament stories. And often the first time we heard these stories was in Sunday school. And if you're familiar with these stories, great. If you're not familiar with them, that's okay too. We're going to kind of talk you through them. But the thing about Sunday school, children want to be entertained. They like the stories that we talk about in the Old Testament because it's entertaining. There's a flood that covers the earth, and there's a boy that defeats a giant. Those are exciting. Those are entertaining. As adults, we start to wrestle with them a little bit differently, though, because our experience is not like what we read. We start to evaluate, could this actually be true? Is this real? I mean, I used to believe that when I was a kid, but now the world is different than when I was a kid. I look at things differently. My perspective has changed. I hope your perspective has changed from when you're a child. But you evaluate them differently, and sometimes that's enough for us to walk away from faith. Or at least say, you know what, I don't really know if I believe all of that any longer. So in order to re-engage with these stories, at least some of them, we thought we'd do this series and really kind of evaluate them on a different perspective, where we'd look at them from an adult perspective. We get into the context of why it was written to start with. Not is it real or is it true or not. Not is it valid or not, but why was it written to start with? So we're going to take a look at context, but before we even get into the story, we should probably talk about the Bible as a whole. We think that the Bible is like a book. It's a good book. It's a good book. They call it the good book. You're supposed to read the good book. The Bible is so much more than just a book. It is a collection of 66 books. It's divided into the Old Testament, the New Testament. The Old Testament we don't spend as much time on. We usually spend a lot of time on the New Testament. That's because the New Testament's all about Jesus' life and ministry. New Testament was written by a handful of authors over a fairly short period of time. Old Testament, written by 40 authors over 1,200 years. So very different styles of writing, genres of writing. It's all in there. I mean, there's poetry, there's narrative, there's all kinds of stuff. Topics are super broad. We can talk about depression. We can talk about hope. We can talk about war and espionage. We can talk about sex. We can talk about all kinds of stuff. If you name it, you're going to find something that's connected to it in there. So really, when we talk about the Bible, we need to think of it more than just a good book to a library. And so if you're trying to find something to connect with, you're like, well, what am I dealing with right now? Kind of sift through the library and figure out something that's going to be applicable to my life right now. And when we're doing that, we read these stories and we're like, well, is it actually true? Because I've got some giants in my life and they don't seem to be fallen because I've got a slingshot in hand. We start to evaluate it differently. Is it actually true? So the thing about another difference between Old Testament and New Testament. New Testament, Jesus, when he taught, he used parables. These are made-up stories in order to make a point. Every single parable, there is a God figure in the parable, and there's a you figure in the parable. So that was true of Jesus' time when he was giving it to a live audience, speaking to them. Yes, this is about you. This is for you. You're trying to figure out who God is, who you are, and how the two relate, what God is all about. That's how Jesus taught. The Old Testament, we try to understand it in that same form. But that's not the way it was written. The context of the Old Testament was about them way back then. It's not about us. There's not an author trying to say, well, in 2,000 years or more than that, in thousands of years from right now, there's going to be someone sitting in a room and we need to talk about them and how this story ties to them. That's not why it was written down to start with. These stories communicate something far, far greater than just some bizarre aspect of life or some entertaining aspect. They weren't crafted and created in order to entertain your kids before going to bed. That's not why they're there. And yet so much of us, we put it in that category. We think, here's the Bible. I guess I have to believe everything about it. It used to be entertaining when I was a kid, but now as an adult, I don't know if I really can grasp that fully or not. So the last couple of weeks we started off with Noah's Ark. We looked at that for a little bit. We looked at last week David and Goliath. Amy talked about David and Goliath. That was great. We realized that those stories weren't written because of the chaos, because of the bizarreness of the story, but something that was far, far more significant. Understanding what God is like, understanding who God is as a whole. That's why they were written down, because they were so significant in the lives of these people way back when in that context. So we try to read it through our lens rather than theirs. So we're trying in this series to switch it around and actually look at it through an accurate context. This morning, I'm going to wrap up, and to be honest, I'm not going to take my foot off the ridiculous pedal. Like, if anything, we're going to smash down on that a little bit harder. Like, we're going full bore here. We're going to look at a whale of a tale. No? Okay. We're looking at Jonah and the whale, right? We're looking at Jonah and the whale. And if you've heard this story before, great. You're probably familiar with it. If you're not, if you haven't heard it before, let me give you kind of the rundown. Long time ago, there was a man named Jonah, and God asked him to be a missionary to the city of Nineveh. And Jonah didn't want to go because the city of Nineveh was scary. And so Jonah got on a boat, went the opposite direction, and then there's a big storm, and the people on the boat threw him over, and a big fish or whale, we can debate about that later, swallowed him whole and spit him out on dry ground back towards Nineveh. And then Jonah was like, you know what, I guess, okay, God, I guess I'll do what you asked me to do. That's kind of what we understand. That's what we remember on the flannel graph of that story, if you remember flannel graphs in Sunday school. So we're going to try and take that story off the flannel graph and put it back into our hands and try to deal with it in a different level. We read ourselves right into the story as Jonah. We have a moral of the story, right? There's a moral of the story, and the moral of the story is don't disobey God, right? Don't disobey God, or else he'll create a creature that's going to swallow you whole and kidnap you and then spit you out eventually. Like, this is the moral of the story. Don't disobey God. He'll send a large creature to swallow you whole and kidnap you, right? Which is great when you're telling your kids this story, because you're like, also, don't disobey Dad, because there's a different creature, there's a different monster that's going to come out if you disobey me one more time. But we read ourselves into this story all the time. And when we do this, the problem is we think that the whole story is about disobeying God. And then we have this thing where it's like, if I disobey God, then that means that God is disappointed with me. And if God is disappointed with me, then I have to do something to earn back my relationship with him. And it's all about this pendulum swinging of, I've got to do enough and earn enough in order to be made right with God. And we have this huge burden that we carry on our shoulders throughout life, because we know we can't do enough. We've messed up too much. We've mistaked too much. We've sinned too much. We can't do enough. So we're living in this constant tension of God's disappointed with me. But you're missing the entire point of and the purpose that God created us for was relationship. Not to do something for him, but to be in relationship with him. So these stories were not concocted to, like I said, to have a bedtime story for Luke, for him to learn these morals of the story. These stories were written down for a greater reason, something far, far greater. And I learned something in Bible college, and it stuck with me still today. This has been a while ago. But context matters. Context matters. I mean, I learned a lot more than just that in Bible college, but that was one of the things. Context matters. You can't look at something isolated from why it was written or how it was written originally. If you don't understand the author or the context of the time and the region and the area that it was written into, if you don't understand the purpose that it was written for, if you don't understand why it was written to start with, there's a decent chance we're going to get off. We're going to get sidetracked. We're going to get confused onto why this was written. We're going to think it's just a story to entertain us, and it's not. Context matters. So the context of Jonah and the whale is this, that there's two nations that are at war with each other. They're constantly battling each other, Israel and Assyria. Israel, you probably heard a little bit about, you might be familiar with because they're still around. Israel is this nation that God created and chose to be his people. And not only that, but his special people to be an example to the world around them of what God is truly like. So imagine you have this like ancient culture and cultures with a bunch of different nations around, and in the middle of all of that, God's like, you know what? In order for people to see what I'm like, I'm going to create this special people, and they're going to be my example. They're going to be the, not the mirror image, but something that reflects who I am in those moments, so they can learn a little bit about me. This is in the 8th century BC when this is all happening. The other nation is Assyria, and they're very different than Israel. Assyria is the worst. They would lay siege to cities, meaning that they would surround it and then just wait until they starved themselves out, till the white flag of surrender would come up. And then the army, the military would walk in, they'd capture all the Israelites, they'd take them back to Assyria with them. And then it wasn't just that, they would do horrible, horrible, horrible things to those slaves, to those prisoners. Things like they would behead them. Things like they would impale them on stakes. They would cut their heads off. They would skin them alive and display the skin on the wall like as a trophy. I mean, these people were the worst. If they decided to let you live as a prisoner, they could do whatever they wanted with you. But if for whatever reason they're like, you know what, I'm going to let this person live, they would probably just cut a limb off, like cut your arm off, cut a nose off, cut an ear off, and just let you live disabled, disfigured for the rest of your life. So, needless to say, this was more than just a political misunderstanding between two groups. They were at odds to a great degree. In Israel, if you can imagine this, Israel was hoping that their God would step in and demolish. Like justice would rain down on Assyria. That they would be wiped from the face of the planet. Because think about that. If that's the practice, if that's the culture, if that's what these people are about, well then yeah, get rid of them. They're just taking up space that other people that would be far greater should be in. So let's just wipe the table off. Let's just get rid of them and get rid of our enemies because we're supposed to be the people of God. We're supposed to be your chosen people. Take care of us, God. That is the midst of the story that Jonah shows up into the midst of that chaos. So Jonah chapter 1 verse 1 says this. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. Now, here's the problem. Jonah understands. Even with this just initial statement, he's like, uh-oh. This is not going the direction that I think it should go. Because God should just act. There should no be warning shot across the bow. There should no be opportunity. And Jonah knows this about God. If he takes this route, there's going to be a warning. If he takes this route, there's going to be an opportunity for grace and mercy to be extended. And he wants there to be no opportunity because they didn't give the Israelites an opportunity to live peacefully. He knows that this will be mercy and a mercy opportunity. But he desires justice, right versus wrong. So Jonah responds to God's message to him to go and be a missionary. He responds by just walking away. Just going the opposite direction. Jonah responds with action. God didn't respond with action to what's been happening. He responded with words. Jonah responds with action. Just walks away. He's like, yeah, I'm gonna get out of town. And often when we hear this story, when we're a child, or even as an adult, we read this and we're like, Assyria's pretty bad. This would have been a place that you didn't want to wander into, their territory, especially alone. And here God is sending Jonah in the middle of it all. So Jonah, we read it like, oh, Jonah's probably afraid of what might happen to him. Because for sure he's losing a limb, at least that much. If he's going to preach against him, he's probably not coming back with a left arm. That's just the reality of it. Okay, so we read that and we think, oh, it's fear. No, it's not. It's Jonah saying, not on my watch, God. I'm not doing it. Digging in. He's fleeing God, not fear. So this is a map just so you get a bigger picture of what's going on. Jonah's over here, Israel. He walks and gets to this port town or port city of Joppa. And here's Nineveh. Okay, that's 550 miles away. He takes a boat from Joppa across the entire Mediterranean Sea to Tarshish. That's where he's headed. 2,500 miles or so in the wrong direction. He's putting the Mediterranean Sea between him and what God asked him to do. He's like, oh yeah, God? This is the edge of what is known. I'm going as far as I can get away in the opposite direction. That's where I'm headed. What do you think about that, God? And if you're familiar with this story, you know he doesn't make it there. God pretty quickly reminds Jonah that he hasn't outrun anything or anyone. Right? God sends something his way. So Jonah chapter 1 verse 4. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. Continuing on, next verse. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. Now, these sailors were not they didn't get together and decide, hey, you know what sounds like fun right now? Let's go on a booze cruise. Have you ever been on a boat? Let's just go hang out for a while. These men live their entire lives on the sea. They're very familiar with their vessel that they're on. They're very familiar with what the sea does, how to act, how to react in it. These men, these hardened sailors, are terrified for their life. They're probably not like prayer warriors that we talk about at church sometimes. That's probably not them. They're just reaching and grabbing whatever God they know of. They're like, do you know any more gods? Because mine's not working right now. They're praying to any God that they can think of in this moment. And not only that, to the degree that they're throwing everything on board, off board. This is the last-ditch effort for survival. Now, what do you think Jonah is doing in this moment? In verse 5, but Jonah had gone below deck where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. There's a giant storm happening all around him, and Jonah's asleep. Because there's a giant storm happening inside of Jonah, and the storm outside doesn't compare. He's like, yeah, storm, I'm out. I'm sleeping. This is physical too? Cool, I just thought it was just me inside of me. I thought it was just in my heart. I thought it was just my spirit that is wrestling with God. Jonah is disobeying God, and in this moment, the sailors are terrified. The captain goes down to to where Jonah is, and he talks to him and wakes him up. He's like, hey, are you okay? Something's going on, and you're just sleeping. So let's talk. Have you made any gods angry lately? Because this isn't normal. What's happening around is not just like a squall that came up. This is something beyond that. And Jonah's like, well, if you don't know this about me, I'm a Hebrew. It's another word for an Israelite. We believe that there's one God only, and He asked me to do something for him, and I'm choosing not to. I climbed on this boat to go the opposite direction of where he asked me to go. And the captain's like, that's a bold decision. Bold move. And so they ask him, they're like, well, obviously this God has control of nature. This God is not happy, which they're very familiar with gods that are not happy. But this God is doing something about it that's felt. Jonah's like, you should probably throw me overboard. They're like, I don't think that's a good idea because you see how angry he is with you right now? Can't we just turn the ship around, go the opposite direction? Jonah's like, no, throw me overboard. Throw me overboard. Now here's something that I've been thinking about this week. Jonah could have asked them to turn the ship around. And I bet the moment that they started to move the other direction, I bet the seas would have quieted down. I'm just reading into this, but I'm just guessing. Jonah in this moment is making another statement. Because he's not planning on anything else happening once he's tossed into the sea. He's just giving the sailors a way out. He's saying, I would rather die than go back there. You can do whatever you want, God. I'm not doing it. You think you sent a storm? Oh, cool. I'm not doing it. I'd rather die than do what you're asking me to do. So finally he convinces the sailors, they throw him overboard. What happens? A giant fish swims up, swallows him. And there's been debates, fish or whale, and I've heard a lot of them. That's not the point. I like to think about these things too, though, like the whole debates. If God is acting in a supernatural moment, why do we argue and debate on natural things? They're like, well, he wouldn't survive in the stomach of a great creature because of the acid. You don't think God, that is supernaturally sending a creature to swallow him and created this storm, could do something about stomach acid? So, Jonah, in the belly of the beast, here's another thought. I know, my mind just goes on a tangent, but do you think that God created this creature as it's swimming up to swallow him? Like it's forming in that moment? Like it's coming into being? Or, and I don't know which is more impressive, or do you think that 100 years before, because a beast that big has to grow up, right? A fish that big's got to grow for some time. Do you think a century before God created that with this whole singular purpose in mind and kept it safe, kept it growing the whole time? I don't know. Either one, super impressive. I can't do it. Only a supernatural God can do that. But here's what we know. Jonah gets swallowed. He spends some time in the belly of the beast. Now, I don't know if you've been swimming in the river lately, or if you've been... I'm not going to stereotype. But if you are a type of person that you're swimming in the river and then something bumps up against your leg, what do? You freak out. You get out of that river as fast as you can, right? Back in the boat, back on the shore. Jonah is in this place where these things are bumping up against him all the time. Is that seaweed? Is that something else? Who knows what this creature swallowed also? There's some things in there, I bet. It probably also doesn't smell great in there. There's zero light. He's in complete pitch black darkness. His physical experience is now in anguish as much as he is struggling against God. And in that moment, it takes him some time, but in that moment, with nothing else for him to do but to ponder, but to think, but to wrestle with what he's decided, he starts to move back toward God. He starts to apologize okay, God. Okay. Because now he can't even be thrown into the sea to die. God's like, you know what? I'll catch you. That's fine. I got you. He has no choices left. He starts to repent. Move back in God's direction. So, this giant creature takes him after 3 days, 3 nights, in the middle of the pitch black, spits him up on dry land. In fact, this is what the verse says. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land, which is a fun term. Vomited him up. I know what vomiting is like. I don't know what it's like to be vomited. Now, in Sunday school, this is kind of where the story really tails off. Because all the exciting stuff is over now, right? And we kind of get back to that moral of the story. You better not disobey or God's going to get you. God's going to get you. And the rest of the story we don't think is really that important. It's like, yeah, okay, if remember he goes and he talks to the Ninevites, and then they decide, yeah, we want to change our ways, and then he's grumpy and upset underneath the tree. That's kind of the end of the story. It just kind of peters out, like, okay, whatever. It gets far less entertaining at the end of the story. But we put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable. That didn't hit either. That's fine. We put our focus on the wrong area in this story. Like, we think it's all about the giant fish. It's not. Remember, context, Israel. This nation that's supposed to be God's chosen people has struggled a bit. And if you read through the history of Israel, they're on the constant pendulum swing also. Like, they try to be good, and then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, but those other people around, they're doing some things too. And they start to adopt and bring in some of the other nations' ideology. They start to bring in some of their own gods. They start to worship them also. They start to blend these two cultures together. And God's not about that, because remember, they're set aside not to blend with, but to be set apart to be an example for. And then there's big wars, there's big fights, there's big battles to create this separation again. They kind of get their heads screwed on straight, and before they can truly be an example, they slip right back into it again. And there's constant back and forth, back and forth. You know, it's a struggle to do this. And in our case, maybe I'll just speak by myself. When you are trying to be the example for somebody else, and you just get wrapped up in your own stuff, and you're not doing a very good job of being an example, that's exactly what Israel's been through historically. Sounds familiar to me. Jonah, in this moment, you know, as the audience that had listened to this story, after it was written down, they're telling it, and reading it, letting people know about it. All the other Israelites, they'd be on board. They'd be like, yeah, I would have done the exact same thing. That's exactly what I would do. Because they wouldn't have fled, you know, out of fear. They would have fled from a God that was no longer prioritizing their nation. They would have assumed, God doesn't have my back anymore. God's doing something on behalf of somebody else, and I'm not about that. I'm about us. Which brings up this massive question. And some of you have wrestled with this. Some of you have been terrified to actually say this out loud. So we're going to put it on screen at church. If God isn't just, is he still worth following? Because that's what every single Israelite that was, you know, around this story at this time, Jonah's life, as well as the other stories, you know, when the story is being told, the audience that's reading this, they all would have been wrestling with this. Because in their hearts and their minds, they knew what was right and wrong. They were right. Assyria was wrong. Why is God moving in the wrong direction? And if God is functioning outside of what you believe to be just and right and good, is he still worth following? This story is full of plot twists. I mean, from start to finish, there's nothing that you expect about this story that's actually going to end up that same way. Jonah, who's supposed to be this really good guy, disobeys God. Single God, like the only God. Disobeys a direct order from God. But this God is too good. Like he's loving somebody else instead of Israel, his chosen people. Like, well, come on, take care of us. We're getting hurt. We're getting killed. We're getting, you know, brutally murdered out there. And you're going to care about somebody else. You're going to move in their direction. You're going to offer up an opportunity for them to turn directions. And then, I mean, from Assyria's perspective, they don't even know this God. They know that they're battling this other nation that worships that God. They hope that God fails. They don't know us. They don't know this Israelite God. And yet this God moves in their direction. From the outside, it looks very much right versus wrong, good versus evil. But the deeper you get into it, it's like it's a mess, really is what it is. This story messes with all of our expectations of what it should be, what should happen, what shouldn't happen. We love our perspective of right and wrong. And we love stories that further confirm and define it. When I hear a story that is exactly what I think inside, we're like, that is the perfect illustration. I love that story. You hear one that's a little bit different, like, I don't know about that one. I'll go back to my story over here. This is a really good one. This is so difficult to wrap our minds and our hearts around. But like I said, in this moment, Jonah submits to God. Belly of the beast for 3 days will do it. He gets spit out, vomited out on the beach. He goes to Nineveh. He starts preaching this message, which is, if you don't change, destruction is going to happen. Because this God can do it. But there's no way out. Repent. Repent. Introduce yourself to this God. Move in His direction. So He does this. And God orchestrates the whole thing. Right? Imagine this. God orchestrating, saving a nation that's been just brutal to His own people. Israel and Jonah hate it. This is not what they wanted. This is not what any of them wanted. It's the opposite. In chapter 3, verse 5. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. Now, if you can go back, I like to think when a fast was proclaimed, like Jonah, first of all, do you think he's giving it his best shot when he's like preaching? I don't think so. He's like, hey guys, something bad's going to happen if you don't change your ways. That's it. And they're like, oh my goodness, I couldn't believe it. A fast is proclaimed, and Jonah's like, you want to fast what? Are you going to fast skinning us alive? You're going to fast from like chopping our limbs off? Is that what you're fasting from? For a week, you're not going to cut off my arm? Is that what you're going to do? Good job. Way to go. A fast is proclaimed. Jonah probably still not super happy about it. Sackcloth is this material that people, when they're in mourning, put on. It's itchy, it's scratchy. It's an inward-outward thing. Like your anguish inside, you're dealing with some anguish, dealing with some like frustration, anger, sorrow, loss. Outside, you wear sackcloth to mirror that also. So this is a thing of mourning. They recognized the great sins that they've been doing, and they were in mourning now because of it. Continuing on, next verse. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. That's not what you would expect a king to do. That a king would humble himself because one man, one missionary walked into his village, into his town, into his city, and said some things. It impacted him this much. He humbled himself. Amen. Think of the mindset that these people would have had. The audacity that they would have had to have been doing what they'd been doing in their history, to now to this point, he humbles himself, sits in dust. I think it's funny if you read through the whole story. It's not just people, it's animals too. So, the pictures and the videos you see of like chihuahuas wearing sweaters? That was happening. Like sackcloth on chihuahuas. They're in mourning too. But these people are hoping that God would relent and would hold back the justice, the judgment that they knew could happen. And Jonah was hoping for the exact opposite thing. It's like, please don't respond to this. Please ignore me. I've already tried to essentially commit suicide, so just kill me. Kill me now, and then you'll end up experiencing the judgment of God. That's not what happens. It's the exact opposite of what Jonah was hoping for happened. So in verse 1 of chapter 4, and they're repenting. And Jonah saw their changed hearts and worshipped God because he knew that only God can change the hearts of the wicked. Nope. That's not what happened. That's what we would have assumed, right? This would have been a nice bow on the story. Like, oh, and then he came around and he's good with God. Like the whole, oh, okay, we're good now. Like that feels good if that's the story. That's not what happened. This is actually what happened. Next verse. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong. And he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, isn't this what I said? Lord, when I was still at home, it's like this is what I knew was going to happen. I knew this was going to happen. Continuing on, next verse, verse 2. That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. Remember, 2,500 miles, opposite direction, clear across the sea. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God. Jonah's doing whatever he can to hold back God's grace and compassion. Slow to anger, abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. Like, I've been trying to do this the whole time. Like, I don't want any part of what you're doing. I'm not about that. I'm not about it. And our fairy tale story has gotten very confusing. It was not written because of the entertainment value inherent in a large fish swallowing a man alive. That's not important. What's important? What's important is we're learning what God is like. Don't get lost in the special effects that is playing in your mind as you hear the story. That's not the point. Israel was to be the example of God to the people around him. And they weren't doing a great job. And God decided in this moment to do something about that. It's like, you know what? I understand you're angry. I understand you will not turn your anger away from these people to be an example. So I'm going to step in front of this. I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to show the redemptive love that I offer. Not just to you, my people, but to all people. To each other, to others around. We get too caught up in the struggles, in our own struggles to be the example. Right? This is apparently this vulnerable morning. Like this morning of vulnerability. I do this all the time. I get so caught up in me. What I want, what I'm too tired to do, what I just don't want to do as a whole, to do the thing that I know I should be doing. And maybe it's not specific as God has asked me to do, or maybe it is. But my own stuff gets in the way of me portraying how great God is to those around me. We do this all the time. Unfortunately, the thing that's known about Christians in our world today, people that are supposed to be following Jesus, is that we're a bunch of hypocrites. Because we portray one thing and we do another thing. It's the same thing. We're all people. We're all broken. Our humanness is real, regardless of what role or spot you're in. And recognizing that God wants to do something greater than that, not just in you, but through you for other people to see Him and to meet Him. This story breaks all the expectations of what we want. Right? It's not what we want. It's not how we want to end. But it shows that this God was different than any other God around. And it begs the question, can you forgive your enemy? When God asks you, can you forgive your enemy? How many times has God extended grace and mercy to you? You know what grace and mercy is? Grace is the things that are given to you that you didn't deserve, you didn't earn. Mercy is withholding judgment, withholding the repercussions that we do deserve. How many times has grace and mercy been extended to you when you didn't deserve it? I'm going to give you a hint. Every time it was extended to you, you didn't deserve it. Because that would not be grace or mercy without it. You've never deserved it. We've never deserved it. And yet, how hard is it to forgive our enemy? We withhold that. We're great when it's a friend. We're great when it's someone that we like. But what about it's someone that we don't like? Another question, does your past have to follow you into your future? Now, we believe that God sets up systems in place where there are natural repercussions for our choices and our decisions. Like we do this is going to follow you up. And in that, there's this amazing thing that God has done. It's like, yeah, you're going to have to deal with some repercussions, and I'm also extending something else to you. That even though that's in your story, that doesn't discount you or that doesn't remove my love from you, my forgiveness for you. I mean, think of how bad the Assyrians were, and yet God was willing to move in their direction. The story ends with Jonah throwing a temper tantrum. He's angry, he's just upset, rah, 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 grumbling. And God decides to engage him in his temper tantrum. This is not what parents do. I mean, maybe you do, but as a parent, when Luke's throwing a temper tantrum, I call it out like, hey, stop throwing a fit, and then I walk away until he's done throwing the fit. Like, okay, you just do that by yourself until you wear yourself out. Take a nap. Great. God decides to engage Jonah in his temper tantrum. It's like, Jonah, there's 120,000 people in that city, and they don't know their right hand from their left hand when it comes to their moral compass. They don't know right from wrong. What am I to do? Just wipe them off the face of the planet just because? Am I not supposed to extend the same grace and mercy I've extended to you to them? Does my love that you're aware of not reach beyond just you? Shouldn't I care about them? I created them. They may not be my chosen representation of me, which you're doing a bang-up job on right now. But don't I still love my creation? There's this ugliness that's hidden in the story. Because it's hidden in all of us. We have a little bit of Jonah in all of us. That we're great. We love night of worships when God's dealing with us. We're like, oh, God is so good. We have that moment where God intercedes on our behalf, where something changes, something happens, and we recognize God was all over that. We love those moments. We get emotional about those moments. The moment that God asks us to do that for someone else and extend that same thing, that grace, that mercy to someone else, what do? We Jonah up. I'm not doing it. You can't make me. Send a fish. Not only is God for us, God knows us. And there's nothing that we can do to make God love us less. And there's nothing that anybody around you, your enemies included, can do to make God not love them. God would extend His grace and mercy to you as well as others. And that is a gift. And if you've been in the spot where you're like, honestly, I'd rather die than to be caught up in that type of story, I'm not doing it. I'm going to tell you from personal experience. You're not truly living if you don't allow God to use you this way. There's a level of life that is available to you. When you get to be part of someone's story, there's nothing that can touch it. There's nothing that can touch it. It is incredible. It is the greatest gift that can be bestowed upon us, that God would use us to impact somebody else, to redirect their life, to let them know that God loves them. It's so much easier to debate whether there's a fish or a whale, or could it happen? You know, is that on it? Is it true? It's so much easier to debate that. That's not what the story's about at all. The story's not about the fish. The story is about a God that is willing to do whatever it takes in order to love people, all people. That's a lot more difficult to wrestle with. And the truth of this is it requires us to look in the mirror ourselves. When we evaluate it that way, we look at the context, we must look at the mirror like, oof, how am I doing? How am I doing on that? This was not written because it was bizarre. It was written because it was significant. Significant about God. It moved God out of my corner only to all the corners. Off of my team only to all the teams. Because that's where God belongs. That's where God wants to be. To wrap up, this whole series, I love these massive stories. I love the big, huge, difficult, challenging. Can I actually believe that? Do I actually believe that? I love those stories. Not because of the bizarreness of them. Because of how big God shows up in those moments. Because of my understanding of God expands in those moments. My expectations of what God could be blows out the box that I put him in those moments. Floods, giants, and whales, oh my. There's a God bigger than all of them. He's a big God with big love. We hear these stories, And as a child, we think they're just entertaining. As an adult, there's something so much greater than that. That God would tell us that He knows us, that He remembers us. That God would show us that He runs into battle ahead of us and for us. Not only that, God would move in the direction of our enemies as well to love them, even if we don't want to. No matter what you've done, you cannot escape God's love. You cannot outrun it, even if God's love is love through you for someone else. And this moves us in the direction of Jesus. That Jesus addressed the two greatest challenges that we will have in this life: sin and death. And we can't do anything about it. As hard as you try to not be a mistaker, to not be a sinner, you keep doing it. Why? Because you're human. As much as we try to avoid death, there's still a day. There's still a day coming. And Jesus showed up to address both of those and conquered sin and death on our behalf. And we can have peace in this life and in this world because of that. And we can have a relationship with the Heavenly Father because of that. And I don't know if you've been told this today, but because of what Jesus has done, He also offers the opportunity for you to be adopted into God's family, to be a son or a daughter of the King. And I'll tell you what, that is worth writing down. That changes everything. That's why I love these big stories. Let me pray, and I got some questions for us. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for everything that you've done, for what you continue to do, that you continue to show us who you are. And it might look different than we expected it, but it's more than, it's bigger than. That your love cannot be held back, even when we selfishly want it to be. God, I pray that you would work on us individually before we determine whether someone deserves your love or not. That you would work on us so we can see how great your love has been poured out on us. And when we see that grace and mercy that you have poured out on us, we can't help but live differently and see differently the people around us. God, we love you. We thank you that you first loved us. In your name I pray. Amen. As always, I have a couple questions because I don't want this to end here. So, continue these conversations with these questions coming up. How great was Amy last week? Right. Wherever she went. I don't even see her right now. Is she in here? Cool. I don't even get credit for that. Okay. Do you find yourself debating natural aspects of a supernatural story? It's a hard one to wrestle with. Next question. Is it difficult for you to believe that God's love is bigger than your biggest mistake? And finally, which is harder to believe? That God would extend grace to you or mercy to others? All right, so that is it. I hope you've enjoyed the series, and I hope you come back next week. Have a great week.